Okay, so let's continue with the example with another famous example, which is called the battle of sexes. So you have a man and a woman, and they would like to go out somewhere together. Now, man has a preference for football, and the woman has a preference for tennis. But the most important for both of them is to be together. So if they go separately, so man, let's say, goes to tennis and the woman goes to football, or the man goes to football and the woman goes to tennis, they both get utility 1. They both get utility 0. Because they want to go together. However, if the man goes to football and the woman goes to football with him, then they both enjoy, but the man enjoys more because he likes football. While if they both go to tennis, they also enjoy both. In this case, the woman enjoys more because she prefers tennis to football. So in this case, when they are coordinated in their preferences, but they have differences, that's called the battle of sexes. And let us look at the possible dynamics, or let's say the dynamics of best response, which originates in different places. So, if you originate at, let's say, both going to football, they're going to stay there because it's the best response to go to the same place. And the same goes for if they both go to tennis. Now, if they both are not coordinated, let's say the man goes to tennis and the woman goes to football, here it's going to be funny, because the man, his best response will be to go to football, to go together. Given that the woman goes to football, he also wants to move to go to football. Now, the woman's best response is to go to tennis, because she sees that the man goes to tennis, so she will go to tennis. So the next step, the woman will go to football and the woman will go to tennis. They are again not coordinated. And they're going to jump from tennis football to football tennis. So this dynamics is highly inefficient in this case. And it's by the way important to see that sometimes such dynamics can be efficient, sometimes it's not efficient. So in general, there is no guarantee that such a thing will be efficient. Maybe there will be some classes of games for which we could prove that the dynamics always has some properties, say it converges or whatever. But in general, we cannot guarantee this. That's an important observation. Another classical example is traffic coordination, or let's say it in an abstract manner, it's pure coordination. They only care about being coordinated. So it's like the battle of sexes, only that they are completely symmetric and they are completely equal in their preference. So the story is that they want to go to, they are two drivers. So if they both drive to the left side of the road and they drive one against the other one in the opposite, then there will be no collision, so they both will safely pass. It's 1-1. Now the same goes if they both drive on the right side of the roads. Now if, however, there is a miscoordination, then they're going to collide, and then that means that they have, let's say, -10 each. Now here there is a similar problem with this dynamic as it was in Battle of Sexes. So if they start both, let's say at LL, if they are coordinated, they're going to stay there. So that's the best response, to stay coordinated, to stay on the same choice. However, if they are not coordinated, they're going to miss one another, because if they, let's say, are on RL, so the row player goes to R and the column player chooses L. So the next stage will be like that. The row player will choose L to get coordinated, And the column player will choose R because she thinks that the row player chooses R, as he did before. And now they're going to play an R. And that's how they're going to alternate between RL and LR. Okay. Another important thing to say is that a game is said to have complete information if the definition of the game, so who are the players, what are their possible strategies, and what are the utilities for each strategy profile, including the possible randomizations, if we have some randomizations which we don't introduce here yet, but here the strategy can incorporate whatever, but when we go to the extensive games when it makes sense. Anyway, if everything about the game is common knowledge, so it's known to both of players, and each one of the players knows that the other one knows it, and everyone knows that the other one knows that the other one knows, and so on, ad infinitum. So it's called common knowledge, that I know, you know, I know that you know, and so on. It's kind of a pre-knowledge, it's completely known, intuitively speaking. Despite it's a precise notion, but it's intuitively speaking that the definition of the game is completely known. And that's going to be our assumption unless we say otherwise. Also in other games, so let's say in extensive game, even in coalitional games, which we're going to do much later, it's going to be common knowledge that everything like that is known. Not necessarily do we know the previous steps of the player in an extension game, which we are going now to define, but we always know the definition of the game itself, so what the player wants. Unless I say otherwise. We can look at an example of an auction where we don't know the private value of the player, how much the other players value the sold item. But we do assume that unless we say otherwise. Okay, so let's now go to the other important model, which is extensive games. Extensive games allows, in this model, action by action, what the players do, allow to model interdependency between actions. So I see that you do that, I do that. What I remember, sometimes we can model that players forget something, which information I have about your action. In certain games which are really like model strategy, I don't know what happened, so I can be surprised and so on. There is, for example, a so-called name Kriegspiel, which is chess when you don't know exactly what the other person did, and you kind of playing blind. So there are many cases which can be modeled by extensive games, so they're more complicated. They are more model dependent because we need to model the exact interaction of the player. But given the model, they allow us for a better model of reality. Now, there are several ways to define them. I prefer to introduce this as trees which show what can a player do given what the other player has done, and so on and so forth. The other players, because it can be more than two. Now, there are other definitions such as the definition by sequences, which talks about the sequences which are allowed. Now, maybe it's better for computation. Maybe it's even sometimes convenient for proofs, but I prefer the definition of trees for the beginning. That's why we are going to work with the definition of trees, but you can look up at the definition using sequences. Maybe do it when we get to this topic of extensive games more in detail on a later stage during the course. You can look it up in the game, a course in game theory by Osborne and Rubinstein. This is in general a very good book, so I warmly recommend it. And in most topics that are covered there, I do follow that book. Not always, sometimes I add materials from other books from the list, but in most topics I follow that book, but in these topics I don't. So, the definition, before we look at the definition, let's look at a nice example which shows how we can model the famous Cuban crisis from the Soviet Union USSR brinkmanship, which happened during the time of Khrushchev, or like the English speakers say, Khrushchev and Kennedy, when there were American missiles discovered in Turkey, which were apparently aimed at the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union wanted to kind of counter that by installing its missiles in Cuba, which also needed some defense from the United States, because of course Cuba was an ally of the Soviet Union. So the story was that Khrushchev deployed the missiles, and then Kennedy noticed that, and then he demanded them to be removed, and he threatened he would sink the ships which were shipping the other missiles, and basically he would pretty much start a nuclear war if the Soviets didn't remove the missiles. And then a secret deal was signed, according to which the Americans actually agreed to remove the missiles they had in Turkey, and Khrushchev did remove the missiles that he had deployed from Cuba. So both sides were happy. But it was really on the brink, at the brink of a nuclear war. And this case is often modeled in many game theoretical models. I remember once there was a model of so-called drama theory, which tried to model interaction as ensues from the name in a more emotional manner, to model the emotion. And they also modeled this crisis. Now let's see how we can model this, the means of a basic extensive form game, without yet defining what an extensive form game there is. Otherwise, afterwards we are immediately going to define it, and we are going to see the details. But now let us just look at the example. So CH is Khrushchev, and KE is Kennedy. So Khrushchev can deploy the missiles, or he cannot deploy them. Choose not to deploy them. So Khrushchev is here the first player. So if he doesn't deploy the missiles, he has the -1 utility, because the United States has its missiles in Turkey. And Kennedy has, the second player has utility 1, because the United States has its missiles in Turkey. So it kind of has its missiles in the vicinity of the possible enemy, of the possible rival. And the leaf of the tree denotes the utilities they get. Now, if Khrushchev doesn't deploy the missiles, then this interaction which we model is considered to be exhausted, so we are done. Now, if Khrushchev does deploy the missiles, then Kennedy has two options. Please notice that Kennedy does know where he is, so he knows, intuitively speaking, after what we are going to define, that his function takes the state. But he needs to decide how to act after Khrushchev has deployed the missiles. So Kennedy knows, we model here that Kennedy actually does know where he is, and he indeed knew. In the actual story, apparently he did knew. He had good intelligence. Or at least the Soviets had really bad camouflage. So Kennedy chooses whether to threaten Khrushchev with sinking the ships or not to. If Kennedy decides not to do anything, then Khrushchev suddenly gets his missiles near the United States. He feels like he has won this moral fight. So he gets one, and Kennedy loses his advantage because of having more missiles near the enemy than the enemy had, so Kennedy gets 0. Now, if Kennedy decides to threaten, as he did, Khrushchev can decide to withdraw his missiles or not to withdraw his missiles. Actually, we know that eventually he withdrew, but actually in reality, well, there was a certain deal which allowed Kennedy actually to look good, and we don't model it here. What we know is that actually the deal went here, so it seems like Khrushchev lost, but in reality it apparently was a win-win, because being an authoritarian leader, Khrushchev didn't actually need to save his face, so to speak, while Kennedy needed it much more. But this model actually models that Khrushchev withdraws his weaponry, and now not only does he have this still weapon in Turkey, he also seems to have lost. Again, it's not like it was before, like it's not as it indeed was, but that's what we model in our case. And Kennedy, not only has he maintained his advantage, he also has managed to have his way in this small interaction. So in this small fight, not a hot fight but a cold fight, so Kennedy has 2. Now, if Khrushchev didn't withdraw, then Kennedy would have a choice whether to actually fulfill his ultimatum and to shoot the ships or not. Now, if he did fulfill the ultimatum, then Khrushchev would have an advantage, so he would get 1, while Kennedy would feel bad and he would lose his advantage, so Kennedy would get -1. Now, if Kennedy did shoot, then of course Khrushchev would have the choice, assuming that Kennedy doesn't shoot and completely destroys the Soviet Union before it can react. Assume that he only starts a war, then Khrushchev can react and then go into a full-fledged nuclear war with a huge loss for both sides, -1,000, or he can kind of remain passive, and then of course Khrushchev would incur a huge loss of not -1,000 but still a large loss to the reputation, to the military and so on, -20, and Kennedy would have a big local victory, +5. So please notice that 2 players, they recur multiple times in various states of the game. In every state, that player, which is denoted in the node from which the edge emanates to one of the children, decides which action to take. And so every node tells which action to take. In this case, by the way, they take actions simply alternately. It's Khrushchev, Kennedy, Khrushchev, Kennedy. Of course, in reality, it can be the order is different. And the important part is that when they reach a leaf, then the game is over, the play is over, excuse me. colloquially we say game over, but in this case we should say play over, because the one instance of playing a game is called play. Play is over, and they see the utilities each one of them get in the leaf. In general, by the way, we can have also infinite trees, and then simply the path in the tree, which is defined by their strategies, defines the utilities. But it's going to be rare. I think they are going usually to work with finite trees. Okay, so now let's go to the formal definition of an extensive game. So, an extensive game, it's a rooted tree. The root is required to denote where we begin. And so, the interaction, every play goes from the root till it reaches a leaf, or it just goes infinitely if the tree is infinite. And again, it's not a typical thing for us here to have an infinite tree. I remind you, by the way, that an undirected tree, it simply begets its direction from the root, but its original undirected, is a graph which does not have cycles and which is connected. Now, so again, naturally we don't want to cycle in our game. We have a well-defined play from the beginning to the end, to an end, and they are connected, so we can always continue. So from get from the root to any leaf. Now, the nodes represent the states during the game, and given the root, we can define the children, of course, of a node. And the sets of all the edges from a node to its children defines the actions that the node can take. Please don't confuse action and strategy. In a non-extensive game, we often confuse them, but still it's better to use the word strategy, because in an extensive game, action is just one move. By the way, it's better to call them moves. I think it's better to call them moves. I already here call them action, but it's better to call them moves, indeed, to avoid confusion with strategies, because often people say action for strategies. It's important that, you know what, I think I might call them moves. I actually may change that and call them moves now. It's better to call them moves. Okay. So I've changed actions to moves throughout. Let's avoid the word action, because instead often people use it for strategies. And move is a basic move here. And so let us go and continue. So a rooted tree, nodes represent the states, because here, as I said, we model the exact state of what happens in this interaction. Now, so exact the moves that the person takes in certain cases. As I say, of course, it will sound much better to take an action, but trust me, it's better to use the word move. I think that if I use the word action, probably it will still mean move by mistake, but I'll try to use the word move. And if you do not sure, please ask. Now, that's all. There are moves that in each state of the person who acts in this state, and the leaves are those who don't have children, and they represent the terminal state, so states from which you stop the game. Now, at each state, exactly one player makes a move. And that's the player the player that was written in our example. The problem is a function P who tells which player makes a move at state V. So P takes a state and returns a player from N. And the players of the game are N are the players of the game. So now, therefore, all the states where player I acts are the inverse image of I. So all the states from which this function goes to player I, denoted as pi minus 1i. It's simply the states from which the function tells who now acts goes to player I. All the states from which I acts. They're called her move states. I suspect many books will call it action state. So let's be aware. Understand what they mean. Because it depends. I know some people call it move, but anyway, be aware when you read book. Okay, so they're called move states of player. Then denoted by vi. So v is all of states, is the set of all the states. Excuse me, of course not from v minus l, because v is the set of all the nodes. I need to fix so. So at each non-terminal state, of course. Oh, you see. At each non-terminal state, I need now my apologies for the but each non-terminal state, each player makes a move because at the leaf nobody moves already. Already can read off the utility, so at each non-terminal state each player makes a move. The function is given from v minus l to n. So for every non-terminal state, function tells which player has been placed, and p minus 1 of I is the set of all the states where I place. Now, so the player is called the active player. You don't have to remember all those things, they are quite logical, so don't worry if you don't remember all the little things. It's important to understand it and remember the main line. But definitely you need to understand it. If not, please ask. So at all the states, the player asks, the player is called the active player. Maybe it's better even to call her moving player, but well. Meaning so that p minus I is at this state is minus 1. And this, so vi is this p minus 1 of I. Now a strategy of play I tells actually how to act at all those states. So it's a choice of a move at each of her move states. So SI, strategy of play I, a strategy of play I, is a function of from vi, from her move state, to the set of all possible moves. That's simply a complicated notation because E denotes all the edges from V to its children. So V to X when X is a child of V. Here we just unite all the EV of all those V's because every V has its own EVs. So we are going over all the states where I moves and unite their edges. And of course we require that the given state, the strategy chooses an edge in the E in the set of possible moves of this state. Not any move. You cannot say that in the beginning, in the root, Khrushchev says that I'm going to act withdraw, because that's not a possible move here. Here you have deploy or not. Here. So the function of Khrushchev does what he does here, here, and here. But it needs to fulfill that at each point it only gives one of those options that exist there. So I simply have written formally all this story. Now a strategy profile determines a path from the root to the leaf, or an infinite path. The leaf is not met given the profile. And to define the utility function, you just assign the values to each path. Now, if the paths are finite, so the eventual end in a leaf, then we can just define the utility for each leaf. Otherwise, you need to really define the utilities for each path. Now, please notice that the path being finite does not imply that the paths are bound as a set. It can be that T is infinite and there are paths of every finite length. So they are not bound as a set, but each given path is a finite path. But there also can be a case where the paths are infinite, but again, these exotic cases are not something we are going to do in this basic course. It's important, however, that you see that the definitions are flexible enough to allow for much more than we do. So formally, given a function v from the leaves, I assume that we have a function on the leaves, which of course induces a function on those paths which end at the leaves. And anyway, we need to define the path inductively, regardless that whether we have a function on the leaves or not. So the path is defined as follows. First it begins with the root, then given a sequence till now, so starting from the root, some v, append the move of the active player, so the player PV, look at SPV, the strategy of the player, and look at what the strategy does at V. And that is, now, of course, the strategy gives us an edge, but look at the other edge of this edge. So don't append the edge, you append the other node, the other edge of this edge. I apologize again for this lack of precision. I need to write the other node, but you understand. So if this thing I've now highlighted is Vx, you append the x. I actually can. One second, let me fix it on the fly. Okay, so this process terminates either when this finite version is v, and by the way, then we would not be even able to ask what the strategy of that player says, because there is no player who should act at v. Okay, so now you see I've changed. So now we append x such that vx is this h. Now it's precise. So the process terminates either at when we reach a leaf, and this then we call this play finite, or if this play is infinite, then we just continue infinitely. But it's still a well-defined path. So this strategy profile defines a unique path, and the utility of the player I is defined as her utility now given the path. So if we've ended a leaf, we can just say that there is utility at a leaf. In general, we have to have utility at every path. In a finite tree, of course, it's the same as giving utility as endowing each utility with each leaf with a set of utilities for the player. Okay. Let's now review the example of the Caribbean crisis. Once more, so we have the root. Khrushchev plays, chooses between deploy or not. If he deploys, the game terminates, and that's these are the utilities. Otherwise, Kennedy plays, chooses between threaten or not, and if he doesn't threaten, then the game terminates and the utilities are 1-0. Otherwise, Khrushchev gets to play, chooses between withdrawing or not. If he withdraws, the game terminates with -2. Otherwise, Kennedy gets to play, choosing between shooting or not. If he shoots, the game terminates with the utility 1-1. If he does not shoot, Khrushchev gets to play, and then he chooses between reacting or not. And in both cases, this game, so this interaction is such that in both cases the play terminates. Yeah, we should say the play terminates, not the game terminates, because the game is the whole model of interaction. Okay, only 2 players, a very simple example, but now start. So okay, a particular case. By the way, please, if you don't really remember or not understand every little symbol, of course, ask me, but don't worry. In this lecture, it's most important that you just understand the ideas. We are going to go into much more detail later, so just understand the ideas. Now, victory or loss. This is a particular case when you have an extensive game with 2 players, where the possible utilities are 1 to one player and -1 to the other player. So it's either -1, 1, or 1, -1. And if that's the case, we call the player with the utility of 1 the winner, and the other player we call the loser. Excuse me, the examples. Many games in sports, or like a boxing match or chess championships, when you have 2 players. Normal chess game, one game is not such a game, because there we can also have a draw, please notice. And for that we have another particular case. Now, another interesting particular case is either the utilities are -1, 1, 1, -1, or 0, 0. So we will have someone who wins and someone who loses, or we have a draw. An example can be chess, checkers, and many other games. One football match when it's not a championship, and we just allow for draws. Now, sometimes the model will immediately speak about just someone wins or someone loses without even giving numbers. Then we can just provide numbers if we want, by the way. Another thing we can we may need, and that's what we may augment this model with. That's a very flexible model, the extensive game model. We're not going to do all those in reality, but now in this course, of course, but let's look at that. Another thing is randomness. So we let us deal with randomness in the next part.